A single innocent kiss at an office party. 2 years of marriage warfare. And a discovery that proved sometimes the smallest incidents trigger the biggest betrayals. This is a story about how one moment of workplace fun became the excuse for destroying everything we'd built together. I want to tell you a rather ambiguous story, though some of you might not call it ambiguous at all. Everything started with a kiss. You could say it was ancient history that ended up being worse than nuclear war. So, you understand the full picture. I'm 40 years old. My wife Elizabeth is 36, and we have a 10-year-old child. Our finances are stable. Everything seemed normal in our life. The beginning of this entire story, if we can believe my dear wife, was set in motion one evening during our office celebration of February 23rd, which is Defender of the Fatherland Day here in Russia, similar to how Americans might celebrate Veterans Day at work. My colleagues and I were naturally congratulating each other, and by evening we'd had a little celebration at the workplace. The women at work had set up a nice spread for us. I called my wife Elizabeth. Liz, we're having a small celebration here. If you have a chance after work, come straight here to pick me up. We'll finish celebrating here, and then you can drive us home so I don't have to leave my car here. She said, okay. If I had known then how this simple request would end, I wouldn't have had a single drink and would have driven home to pick up anyone from anywhere myself. It turned out that Elizabeth also had a modest celebration at her workplace. That evening, they were also congratulating their male colleagues. We ended up with more bottles of cognac that evening than we'd planned for, and some of our younger staff started playing Spin the Bottle. While the young people played, those of us who were older just sat and watched. I was thinking it was time to text my wife to see where she was. She texted back, "Getting in a cab. I'll be there soon." Good. I had another small glass of cognac and moved closer to the exit where there was a window so I could get some fresh air. My shirt sleeves were rolled up, like everyone else who was feeling good that evening. Suddenly, one of our youngest female colleagues approached me and addressed me formally by my first name and patronymic. Apparently, their bottle had pointed at me and her, and she needed to kiss me as part of the game. Without really waiting for my response, she took my chin with both hands and kissed me, turning her head toward the group to make sure they could see she was completing the assigned task. As you can probably guess, this was precisely the moment when my wife walked in. Picture this scene. We're standing there, this young woman and I, appearing as if we'd stepped away from the group for some private business. We both smelled of alcohol, and I'm sure my wife saw the tail end of that kiss perfectly clearly. I pretended as if nothing had happened, and really, nothing significant had occurred. I wasn't at fault here. But that's not how it played out. While Elizabeth and I drove home, we talked as if nothing had happened. I decided we'd probably discuss it tomorrow, if we discussed it at all. I was wrong. The next day, my wife was darker than a thundercloud. I somehow managed to explain what had really happened, and after a couple of days, she seemed to believe me. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it turned out I was far from done with this. 1 month passed, then 2 months, then 6 months, and every opportunity she got, and even when there was no opportunity, my wife would immediately remind me of this incident. Because of these constant reminders, we started fighting more often. I'd say, "If you haven't forgiven me, you should have told me so then, instead of forgiving me first and then reminding me of it every day." As soon as I'd say this and start getting seriously angry, she'd immediately step back, claiming she was just joking and telling me to relax. But if we had another argument, she'd immediately bring it all up again. She'd found the perfect button to push to get on my nerves. Around this time, something like a promotion opportunity came up for Elizabeth. She worked in jewelry sales, and when one of the employees at a larger office location went on maternity leave, they offered Elizabeth that position. It was a bit farther from home, but the salary was higher. She agreed without asking me. The schedule was particularly interesting: 9 a.m. to 8 p.m., 3 days on and 3 days off. I immediately noticed this was the first time I'd ever heard of such a schedule existing, but later I found out exactly what kind of schedule it really was and what hobbies Elizabeth had developed besides work. 1 year and a half passed, and then one evening she came into our living room and said, "I'm tired of all this." At first, I thought she was talking about work. "You don't give me any time or attention at all. Don't bother promising you'll change. You're an adult and you can't be changed. I've decided everything. I've been thinking about this for a long time. The bottom line is, it's time for me to move on." Of course, I was in shock. The next day, I tried to talk to her again, but she maintained the same position. She wasn't going to torture herself with my presence anymore. I didn't want to torment anyone, so I decided to go away for a couple of weeks to a friend's empty country house. Sometimes people get tired of each other, and as a result, we'd reconcile. But it turned out to be much more interesting than that. Fortunately, this saga finally ended. My friend called me and asked for the address of the salon where my wife worked. "Listen, you keep saying it's so fancy and large. Where is it located? I need to buy a gift certificate there, and maybe I'll talk to your wife while I'm at it." I gave him the address and phone number. 2 hours later, he called me back and said my wife wasn't there. There were 2 consultants on site, but no management and no Elizabeth. "Maybe it's a shift change," I told him, but my heart was uneasy. I got in the car and drove home. When I arrived, no one was home. So where was she then? I called her, she didn't answer. I called her parents, she wasn't there either. It was getting toward evening. I got in the car and drove to her workplace. I parked at a distance and waited. As 8 p.m. approached, I saw Elizabeth coming out of the salon with a young man, maybe 20 or 25 years old. They walked toward his expensive foreign car, too expensive for someone his age, and got inside. I won't describe my emotions, they were contradictory. On one hand, I'd at least found out that my suspicions weren't groundless. On the other hand, I wanted to get out and ask questions directly. But fortunately, I restrained myself, and as it turned out, that was the right decision. I sat there thinking about where they would go. They drove to our neighborhood. He dropped her off at our building entrance and drove away. I immediately parked my car right there and went straight up to our apartment. I opened it with my own key. She was already talking to someone on her phone. I took the phone from her hands, and while it was still unlocked, I went into her messages. For this entire month, while she'd been living the single life, apparently my return wasn't particularly expected, so she hadn't deleted any of the messages with this young, handsome man. I read everything there. It turns out that in this main office, there's a management office, and this young man is actually the son of one of the executives in this jewelry chain. That's apparently why he didn't come up to our apartment. They had an office right at the workplace for their activities. Now, it was clear why my friend hadn't found Elizabeth at her workplace today when he visited the jewelry store. The work was probably being conducted in the office. I didn't see any tears or sniffling that evening. She didn't even particularly deny anything. On the contrary, she finally expressed everything she'd been thinking about me for the past 2 years. Of course, they brought up that kiss from February 23rd, adding that it was just the tip of the iceberg, and supposedly she was sure there were many other betrayals behind me that she wouldn't bother remembering or investigating. So, as I said, the whole situation is ambiguous. Someone might say that I brought it on myself, that woman kissed me on February 23rd, after all, but I consider this nonsense. Even if the February 23rd incident hadn't happened, there would have been some other pretext. It was just a cheap justification. The real tragedy of this story isn't the kiss itself, it's how Elizabeth weaponized that innocent moment to justify 2 years of psychological warfare, followed by a calculated affair. Think about the timeline here. A colleague kissed me during a party game in front of a room full of witnesses. It lasted maybe 3 seconds and meant absolutely nothing. But Elizabeth turned that moment into a 2-year campaign of guilt, manipulation, and eventual revenge. Every argument became an opportunity to bring up that kiss. Every disagreement gave her ammunition to make me feel guilty for something I hadn't even initiated. She systematically wore down our relationship while simultaneously setting up her exit strategy. The 3 days on, 3 days off schedule wasn't about a promotion, it was about creating a perfect cover for an affair. While I was at home feeling guilty about a party game kiss, she was conducting a full-blown relationship with her boss's son in his office. What's particularly calculating about Elizabeth's behavior is how she initiated the separation. She didn't wait for me to discover the affair or confront her about suspicious behavior. Instead, she proactively told me she was tired of everything and needed time apart. This gave her complete freedom to continue her relationship while keeping me in limbo, uncertain about the future of our marriage. The emotional manipulation was masterful, in the worst possible way. She made me believe that I was the problem, that my lack of attention and inability to change were destroying our marriage. Meanwhile, she was literally having an affair at her workplace and using our temporary separation as cover for intensifying that relationship. When I finally caught her, her response revealed everything about her true character. Instead of remorse or apology, she doubled down on blame. That February 23rd kiss became not just a mistake I'd made, but evidence of a pattern of betrayal she was sure existed, even though she had no evidence of any other incidents. This is textbook projection. Elizabeth was the one who had been unfaithful, but she convinced herself and tried to convince me that I was the real cheater. The innocent kiss became her psychological justification for actual infidelity. The age difference between Elizabeth and her lover also reveals something important about the nature of this affair. This wasn't about finding true love or deeper connection. This was about excitement, power, and probably revenge. She was 36, involved with someone who was probably 23 or 24. He was the boss's son with an expensive car and access to a private office. This was Elizabeth's midlife rebellion disguised as marital dissatisfaction. Looking back, I can see that the February 23rd kiss was actually a gift. It revealed Elizabeth's true character and gave her the excuse she was probably looking for to justify behavior she likely would have engaged in anyway. Someone who would turn an innocent party game into 2 years of emotional warfare, followed by a calculated affair, followed by blame shifting and projection, is not someone you want to spend your life with. The most painful part isn't the betrayal itself, It's realizing that the person you married was capable of such sustained deception and manipulation. Elizabeth didn't just cheat. She constructed an elaborate psychological campaign designed to make me feel responsible for the destruction of our marriage, while she systematically dismantled it from within. If you've ever been blamed for someone else's betrayal, or if you've watched a small incident get weaponized against you over time, you understand how exhausting this kind of psychological manipulation can be. It's death by a 1,000 cuts, designed to wear down your resistance and make you question your own reality. The jewelry store affair wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign that required months of planning, scheduling, and deception. And when caught, Elizabeth's response was to blame me for driving her to it. Some people cheat and feel guilty. Others cheat and blame their partners for making them do it. Elizabeth fell squarely into that second category, and that tells you everything you need to know about who she really was underneath the marriage facade. That's how one innocent kiss turned into 2 years of blame, manipulation, and betrayal. If you've ever seen something small spiral into the end of a relationship, share it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you've got a story of your own raw reel about the lies people tell, send it to me. My contact's in the description. Because the next story, let's just say it proves that sometimes betrayal hides in places you'd never think to look.